Welcome back, everybody, or welcome, as the case may be. This is the afternoon portion of California Air Resources Board Cap and Trade Program Workshop. We had a session this morning where we touched on some topics related to allowance budgets and allowance allocation. Topics this afternoon relate to the electricity sector and biogenic emissions and biofuels. Thank you for joining us. We've got time set aside until 4 p.m. This afternoon to go over these materials. We will have a break in between the discussion. And so I just want to touch on some logistics before we dive into the bulk of the presentation before we get started. So the workshop is being recorded. It will be posted to our Cap and Trade meetings and workshops page. We have 3.5 hours allotted, again, ending at 4 p.m. In order to hear from as many commenters as we can, we're going to ask that feedback be limited to 3 minutes per session. We've got over 300 participants right now, so want to make sure there's space for everybody. You will be able to submit written feedback online until October 26th. You can find the link to submit feedback as well as all relevant documents, including this presentation, on the Cap and Trade meetings and workshops page. Moving on to the agenda for this afternoon. Broadly, again, electricity emissions, biogenic emissions exemptions. We'll start with introduction to electricity markets. That'll be from Anya Gilbert at CAISO. Then moving into CARB staff presentations on imported electricity, accounting, energy storage systems, electricity imports from unlinked jurisdictions, and the RPS adjustment. We'll have a comment period for those electricity topics, and then we'll take a short break and return with the presentations on biogenic emissions exemptions, and that'll be followed by a second public comment period. I'll now hand things over to Anya Gilbert at the California Independent System Operator. The California ISO manages the flow of electricity on transmission lines, oversees infrastructure planning, and operates the wholesale market, energy market, which is important for this discussion today. So Anya, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to CARB for the opportunity to present today. As Mark mentioned, my name is Anya Gilbert, and I'm a lead policy developer working on greenhouse gas accounting at the CAISO. And I'm here to explain CAISO's regional markets and, important to this conversation, how we account for greenhouse gas emissions in those markets. And I think it's a good starting place to start with our real-time market. It's called the Western Energy Imbalance Market. It was started in 2014. And by real-time, we mean it balances supply and demand across this footprint every 15 minutes and 5 minutes. Currently, about 22 balancing authorities areas participate in it. And where they operate, which is highlighted here in the orange, covers about 80% of the load in the Western interconnection. Because this is a real-time market, this serves about 3 to 5% of load based on volume of transactions, and most supply commitment is in the day-ahead market. Next slide. So recognizing that most supply commitment is in the day ahead, and to leverage the diverse resources across the West and the transmission connectivity between major supply and demand regions, the CAISO, in collaboration with stakeholders, designed the Extended Day-Ahead Market, or EDAM, to deliver additional benefits to those that have been realized in the WEAM. And by extending the day-ahead market across the West, it allows for an optimized commitment rather than relying on bilateral transactions. I'll note that entities that choose to participate in EDAM in the future will still have responsibility over resource planning, transmission planning, and reliability operations functions. Both PacifiCorp and the Balancing Authority area of Northern California, specifically their member SMUD, have indicated their intent to join EDAM. And I'll note that based on the implementation schedules of PacifiCorp and Bank, go live for EDAM is targeted for 2026. Next slide. So now we'll be discussing greenhouse gas accounting in both of those markets. At a very high level, the design reflects the requirements of state cap and trade or cap and invest programs. It allows generators that are subject to greenhouse gas cost of compliance to reflect that cost in their bid to the market using a specific emissions rate, a default rate, or an average rate based on their area. The market then optimizes transfers to a greenhouse gas area, in this case, California, based on a voluntary greenhouse gas bid adder and the energy bid. Next slide. So this slide covers the elements of greenhouse gas accounting design and is really intended to be a reference slide. However, I'll walk through some of the key terms we use in describing greenhouse gas design as it applies to California. So first, the geographic boundary helps the CAISO identify what generation and load are in California and therefore subject to CARB's policies. The bid adder, sometimes called the greenhouse gas bid adder, allows resources to reflect their cost of California greenhouse gas compliance, which ensures efficient dispatch. The counterfactual, or a synonym often used, is baseline, approximates how load outside of California or a greenhouse gas regulation area would be served without transfers. This is kind of a run that gives us a sense of what would happen absent greenhouse gas policies, and therefore, what is surplus that can serve California demand. Next is attribution. Another synonym for it has been deeming, and it determines what resources are economic to serve California load. And lastly, market constraints, which do what it sounds like. It constrains what resources can serve California load, which in turn lowers the potential for secondary dispatch. Next slide. So to put this all together in terms of how EDAM accounts for greenhouse gas emissions, it really starts with a resource electing to make its supply available. And in this example, we have a resource in PacifiCorp. It has both an energy bid, which is something all market participants have, and then it also has a voluntary greenhouse gas bid, which is how the PacifiCorp resource elects to make supply available to California and indicate its willingness to be responsible for the associated compliance costs and compliance obligations of making that supply available. The bid itself indicates both the quantity made available and the greenhouse gas compliance cost associated with making that supply available to California. The CAISO's counterfactual identifies the surplus coming from PacifiCorp. The market determines the total transfer needed to serve California supply. And in this example, the PacifiCorp generator was economic based on its energy and greenhouse gas bid and was therefore attributed a certain number of megawatts to serve California load. Lastly, the PacifiCorp resource is paid for their attributed megawatts. And to do this, the California ISO collects revenue to cover the cost of greenhouse gas compliance from California load and then pays the PacifiCorp generator for its greenhouse gas costs. And I'll note that the CAISO's market is a marginal cost market, so it's the marginal resource that's setting the price that all resources that are attributed are paid. Next slide. So on this slide, I really want to highlight how the design differs based on kind of timing and what market a balancing authority area participates in. The rows indicate the design features, which were the terms we reviewed earlier, and the columns review the market functionality depending on timing and what market the balancing authority participates in. So for the first column, we're looking at the world as it is today for a balancing authority area that participates in the WEIN. For geographic modeling, today we really look at geography based on a balancing authority area rather than a state level, which is important for greenhouse gas accounting. There are bid adders in place, but only for California to reflect existing state regulation. And then below this green bar are all of the enhancements we've made to limit attribution and therefore secondary dispatch. And for the WEIN today, the counterfactual is the base schedule, which is WEIN entities' self-submission of how they intend to operate and the supply they're making available. There are bidding constraints based on the resource bids, but there is no net export constraint. In the second column, this is looking at the future for a balancing authority area that chooses to participate in EDAM and therefore also the WEIN. As a result of the EDAM enhancements and changes, geographic modeling does reflect California as the state boundary. There are bid adders in place for multiple greenhouse gas regulation areas, so for California and for Washington. When it comes to the enhancements made to limit attribution and therefore secondary dispatch, there's an updated counterfactual in place. In the day ahead, the counterfactual is a optimized greenhouse gas reference path. And in the real-time market, the counterfactual is really the difference between the day-ahead energy schedule and the day-ahead greenhouse gas award. There are bidding constraints in place, and newly developed, there is a net export constraint. For an entity after EDAM launches that chooses to only participate in the WEIN, the features will be similar with the exception that the counterfactual will remain the base schedules. So happy to take questions on this at the end, but with that, I'll turn it back over to Mark. Thank you.
Actually, I'll go ahead and take it from here. Thank you so much, Anya. Hello, everyone. My name is Tess McDermott. I'm staff in the Mandatory Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. We are now going to dive into how the CAISO markets interact and how these upcoming changes interact with CARB programs, which may necessitate changes in cap and trade and mandatory greenhouse gas reporting. We'll provide some background on California's imported electricity and the associated emissions, and a brief explanation of emissions leakage. We'll discuss how CARB accounts for WEIM greenhouse gas emissions in our programs and outline some potential amendments to the outstanding emissions or OE calculation that CARB uses to account for leakage in the WEIM and for EDAM in the future. We'll also go over other revisions necessary to account for WEIM and EDAM in our regulations. Please note that generally I will be referring to the Western Energy Imbalance Market as the WEIM, except for the places where I am referencing our current regulation, which uses EIM. Before we dive into changes in California's electricity markets and the potential revisions needed for CARB's regulations to reflect those market changes, I want to provide some background on California's relationship with the Western electricity grid and CARB's requirements to account for emissions from imported electricity. California is interconnected electrically with much of the Western US through the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, also known as the WEC. The WEC includes 14 Western states, 2 Canadian provinces, and Baja California, Mexico, encompassing 38 balancing authority areas. California's electricity grid receives electricity imported to the state via direct transactions between entities and from entities participating in electricity markets that cross state boundaries. California is a net importer of electricity. Under AB 32, CARB must account for all greenhouse gas emissions from the generation of electricity delivered to and consumed in California, whether that electricity is generated in-state or imported. Electricity imports to California in 2020 made up 18.6 million metric tons of CO2e of emissions, which was 5.1% of the total 2020 state greenhouse gas inventory. This data is reported to CARB and verified via the Mandatory Greenhouse Gas Reporting Regulation, or MRR, and has corresponding compliance requirements in the Cap-and-Trade program. The reporting of greenhouse gas emissions from imported electricity occurs annually through MRR. Electricity importers must report imports based on physical delivery of electricity. Imported electricity is reported as from either a specified source or an unspecified source. Emissions data reports are subject to annual third-party verification requirements under MRR. This source-based accounting is consistent with IPCC methods and designed to avoid double counting. Electricity importers, also known as first jurisdictional deliverers, or FJDs, are the party responsible for first placing power onto the California grid at the state border, and are responsible for reporting imports into California, as well as for any corresponding compliance obligations in Cap-and-Trade. The FJD approach is designed to address the interconnected nature of the electricity grid and the potential for emissions leakage, to ensure like treatment of importers and in-state generators, and to support Cap-and-Trade and other CARB programs and maintain a consistent price on carbon. FJD as a concept was initially developed as part of the Western Climate Initiative, which informed the approach CARB adopted in its program. CARB carefully designed this approach in accordance with legislative and federal requirements and to work in the context of California's energy markets. The Department of Justice was also very involved in the drafting of this piece of CARB's regulation. A critical aspect of California's approach to covering greenhouse gas emissions from electricity imports is how we address emissions leakage. As required by AB 32, CARB designed the program to minimize the potential for emissions leakage. Emissions leakage is a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions in California that has a corresponding increase in out-of-state greenhouse gas emissions as a result of the program. Emissions leakage can occur when compliance costs faced by regulated businesses are not shared by their competitors outside the regulated jurisdiction. On the right, you can see an example where we have in-state electricity generators facing competition from out-of-state generators. If in-state producers fully pass their compliance costs to consumers, but out-of-state producers don't face those costs, more unregulated out-of-state electricity may be purchased. This could lead to decreased emissions and production in-state, but increased out-of-state production and emissions. For the electricity sector, emissions leakage is minimized in part through the coverage of imported electricity and reporting requirements. Emissions leakage can and does still occur in the electricity sector, and CARB is required to minimize it. As Anya explained, CAISO currently uses a resource-specific approach in EIM and plans to build on that approach in EDAM. This approach forms the basis for how imports in the WEIM are reported to CARB. Western Energy Imbalance Market imports to California are attributed to specified generation sources via an attribution process sometimes referred to as deeming. Reporters of these imports receive attributed WEIM import values from CAISO to support annual reporting and verification under MRR. These imports are reported to MRR based on the specified source emission factor for the attributed resource. Around 2016, CARB and CAISO found that the design of the WEIM does not account for the full greenhouse gas emissions experienced by the atmosphere from electricity imported to California under the WEIM and results in emissions leakage. Since then, the California ISO has implemented changes to support greater greenhouse gas accounting accuracy in the WEIM, and CARB has adopted provisions to its regulations to ensure any WEIM emissions leakage is fully accounted for and addressed. The emissions leakage is calculated through the EIM outstanding emissions calculation, and CARB requires California utilities to share the responsibility for that emissions leakage through the EIM purchaser provisions that I will cover in the next few slides. The EIM outstanding emissions calculation is in MRR and is calculated as the sum of total California EIM emissions minus deemed delivered EIM emissions. The total California EIM emissions is equal to the sum of all EIM megawatt hours deemed to California multiplied by the unspecified emissions factor, which is 0.428 metric tons of CO2e per megawatt hour, and the transmission loss factor. The deemed California EIM emissions is equal to the sum of all EIM emissions reported to MRR by EIM participant reporters, generally the scheduling coordinators. In 2019, CARB began implementing EIM purchaser requirements. These place the responsibility for EIM outstanding emissions on entities purchasing WEIM electricity. EIM purchasers are California utilities that receive freely allocated allowances under the Cap and Trade program, and who purchase WEIM electricity to serve California load. Out-of-state WEIM load and generation do not incur obligations for EIM outstanding emissions. EIM purchasers may have a compliance obligation for WEIM electricity imported to California. EIM purchasers collectively address EIM outstanding emissions through a deduction to their freely allocated allowances. Outstanding emissions are apportioned to the EIM purchasers based on their share of total retail sales of electricity in California. The EIM outstanding emissions process helps ensure the environmental integrity of the Cap and Trade program. CARB staff is in the process of evaluating changes in CARB's regulations that may be necessary based on the greenhouse gas design in CAISO's adopted EDAM tariff filed with FERC. These changes will ensure that EDAM transactions are accurately covered by MRR and Cap and Trade, and that CARB's regulations appropriately address and minimize the potential for emissions leakage. Any changes to CARB's greenhouse gas accounting for electricity imports must meet state and federal statutory requirements and support implementation of CARB's programs. CARB is not considering fundamental changes to how electricity imports are regulated. Any changes to how electricity imports are regulated need clear benefits that support CARB's statutory requirements, including accuracy, enforceability, and must be implementable. Anya has already described the fundamentals of the EDAM and its proposed changes. Here we want to highlight the areas that are key to CARB's assessment of potential changes to our regulations, and we will note that this is not intended to be a comprehensive list of changes that CAISO is reflecting in their updated tariff. Once EDAM is in place, attribution will reflect California's state boundaries. For EDAM participants in real time, the counterfactual will be the difference between the day-ahead energy schedule and the greenhouse gas award. For WEIM-only participants, the counterfactual will continue to be the difference between the base schedule and the amount attributed. The counterfactual is used by CAISO to identify surplus generation to serve California demand. Attribution to California will also be limited to balancing authority areas that are net exporters, barring reliability issues. And a generator in a balancing authority area won't be attributed to California in excess of its transfer limit. External generators with committed capacity to serve California load will be able to have their full capacity attributed to California. It is important to note that settlement of EDAM transactions will occur in the WEIM. WEIM attributed amounts are still the amounts that will be reported to California and will consist of both WEIM and EDAM transactions. CARB staff have been working with CAISO to determine how we can improve the OE calculation to make it more accurate. Staff is evaluating amending the outstanding emissions calculation to limit its coverage to deemed generation below a resource's counterfactual. Generation attributed below the base schedule or the greenhouse gas counterfactual run are the most likely to result in emissions leakage because the resource was generating that amount of electricity before being selected in EDAM or the WEIM to serve California. Definitional changes and additions are also needed to include EDAM and reflect updates to EIM. Note that all imported electricity will continue to be covered by the Cap and Trade and MRR regulations. This slide gives a sense of what that potential change would look like in the regulation. As I mentioned earlier, currently the outstanding emissions calculation uses the total volume of megawatt hours reported to California in WEIM in the total California EIM emissions portion of the equation. This is the total megawatt hours attributed to California times the unspecified emission factor of 0.428 times the transmission loss factor. Under the potential revisions, the megawatt hours for which outstanding emissions would be calculated would be only those megawatt hours below the counterfactual. In EDIM, this would be the amount attributed to California below the difference between the day-ahead energy schedule and the day-ahead greenhouse gas award. For WEIM entities, only this would be the amount attributed below the base schedule. As we close the slides on this topic, here are some considerations to keep in mind and some questions we would appreciate feedback on for stakeholders. Some considerations are that CARB's goal is to calibrate the OE calculation to reflect CAISO's changes and minimize emissions leakage. Any changes to the outstanding emissions calculation must meet CARB's state and federal requirements and support implementation of CARB's programs, and must work with the existing point of regulation. Here's the questions we are requesting feedback on. Are there other approaches CARB should consider to address emissions leakage from electricity markets? Are there other refinements to the regulations needed to address EDIM transactions? And how should transactions in EDIM or the WEIM that are committed to California be treated in the outstanding emissions calculation? Here I want to highlight that contracts that CAISO determines are committed to California have the possibility of being fully attributed to California. CARB staff are requesting feedback on whether this warrants any different treatment in the outstanding emissions calculation. Okay, and now we will transition to a new topic, the treatment of electricity imports from energy storage systems. In this section, we will cover some proposals and requests for feedback on the reporting of electricity imported from energy storage sources in the Mandatory Reporting Program, or MRR. At the end of this section, we will be soliciting feedback for some outstanding questions on energy storage reporting in MRR. There is a growing need and current build-out of energy storage sources outside of California to meet future state and regional electrification and greenhouse gas reduction goals. CARB has already received questions on how MRR will address the reporting of imports from these sources. The three areas we have identified that require regulatory updates to address this are defining energy storage systems, or ESSs, as specified sources in MRR, so we have a clear understanding of what constitutes an ESS. Providing an equation for how ESS emission factors should be calculated, given that they can be an aggregate of more than one charging source, and establishing a point of regulation for reporting ESS emission factors. Note that this discussion does not include ESSs located inside California, which are only regulated under MRR if they have direct emissions and meet the applicability criteria in MRR. We will need to define energy storage system in MRR for specified sources of imported electricity. We have drafted a potential definition of ESS under MRR, and that definition is that an energy storage system, or ESS, means a device or structure designed and used to store electric potential from electric power generated at another source at one time for discharge at a later time. Energy storage systems can be standalone or part of an electricity generation facility. Our goal with this definition is to capture that ESSs can be more than just standard batteries and can incorporate other technologies and systems such as pumped hydro or electrolysis, and can be charged with power from multiple sources. The use of the term electric potential limits the definition to storage systems that discharge electric energy for import to California and does not include other potential fuel or feedstocks such as hydrogen gas. Since ESSs are not themselves generation sources and can store power sourced from more than one charging source, CARB cannot directly calculate an ESS emission factor using current specified source emission factor calculation methods for an ESS charged from more than one greenhouse gas emitting generation resource. This means that the ESS emission factor calculation will need to rely on the charging and discharging activity of the ESS, as well as the emission factors of those charging sources. Furthermore, ESSs can be located on the same property as a pre-existing generation source, but not be charged exclusively by that source. Some ESSs can be assigned a simple emissions factor. For an ESS charged by a single zero emission specific resource, we can assign a zero emission factor. For an ESS charged by unspecified grid power, we can assign the unspecified emission factor. The potential emission factor calculation is straightforward. The sum of all emissions from power used to charge the ESS over the reporting year, divided by the total power delivered by the ESS to the grid in the same reporting year. If the total megawatt hours discharged is measured by the meter, losses from the ESS will already be factored in. Otherwise, the proposal is to use the original equipment manufacturer or OEM stated losses, or a yet to be determined default ESS loss factor or ELF. When reporting ESS imports in the One Reporting Workbook, transmission losses for ESS power will apply from the point of receipt at the ESS to the final point of delivery into California. To facilitate the calculation of ESS emission factors, we have an initial concept for a new draft Workbook 5 modeled after the One Reporting Workbook. Here's a screenshot of what that might look like, as well as another on the next slide. A potential Workbook 5 could contain tabs for reporting charging activity from both specified and unspecified sources, similar to how electricity importers currently report in the One Workbook. The individual line items could be processed automatically by the workbook to calculate an emission factor for the ESS. A copy of 5 could be uploaded to the tool for each unique ESS reported as additional documentation, subject to third-party verification and CARB review. We're requesting comments and feedback on 2 main questions. The first is which entity should be responsible for calculating the ESS emissions factor if there is more than one entity importing from the ESS. The ESS owner may not necessarily be an importer of electricity to California, and thus would not be currently reporting to CARB under MRR. We are also trying to avoid the complexity of having every ESS importer submit and have verified ESS emission factor data while ensuring that only one verified emission factor is reported per ESS across all importers. Reporters would report charging and discharging activity data of the ESS and be subject to verification. We are also requesting feedback on if there is a need to account for the power stored in the ESS at the start of the calendar year in the calculation of the emission factor, and what emission factor should be applied if those details are not known. Because the emission factors of an ESS's charging sources need to be calculated before emissions from imports can be reported, there may be an unavoidable delay in reporting emissions, where ESS emission factors cannot be released with the One Workbook alongside emission factors for other specified sources, and where there are no other data sets that can be used to calculate an ESS's emission factor without reporting and verification. One possibility is that the entity reporting the ESS emission factor should report and verify an ESS emission factor the year prior to its inclusion in the One Reporting Workbook for imported electricity. An example of this is an ESS that has imports to California first occur in 2024. By February 1st, 2025, the upstream ESS charging sources would be registered with CARB, and CARB would publish their emission factors in March of 2025 for use in 2024 data year reporting. By August 10th of 2025, the 5 workbook would be reported and verified. CARB would publish the resulting ESS emission factor, which is based on the 2024 data emission factors, in March 2026 for use in 2025 data year reporting. This is very similar to the way asset controlling suppliers, or ACS, emission factors are calculated now. However, this also brings up the issue of what emission factor should be used for an ESS if imports must be reported and no verified emission factor has been calculated yet. For instance, in the example shown, what emission factor would be used for imports from that ESS that occur in the calendar year 2024? We are seeking comments on some additional questions that will help us formulate our regulatory updates. This includes, what information will be available from the market to track and tag ESS power? How should the specified source reporting requirements be applied to ESS imports? And should the lesser of analysis be applied to inputs or to outputs from the ESS?
Thank you, Tess. I will now take over and talk about electricity imports from unlinked jurisdictions and also RPS for the Cap and Trade program. As a reminder, we will have a public comment session for all the electricity topics after I finish the staff presentation. Multiple carbon pricing approaches, including other emissions trading systems and carbon taxes, are emerging in jurisdictions served by the Western Interconnection Electricity Grid that serves California, Canada, Mexico, Oregon, and Washington. Staff are evaluating possible approaches to ensuring that electricity imported to California from a jurisdiction that is not linked with California and has carbon pricing does not face cost in both California and the jurisdiction in which it was generated. Regulatory amendments may be needed for the cap and trade program to recognize a carbon price applied by another jurisdiction on electricity imported into California. There are several possible options to address the issue of dual carbon costs and electricity imports: through linkage with the cap and trade program, by providing free allowances to those importers as in Quebec, or by relying on the other jurisdiction to address the dual cost. These options will be further detailed in the next few slides. On the right is a snapshot of recent greenhouse gas emissions from specified imported electricity by state and country. The figure highlights specified imports to California from jurisdictions with active or planned carbon pricing. These include Washington at about 5%, Mexico at 12%, and other Pacific Northwest at about 4% of total emissions from specified imports. The other Pacific Northwest jurisdiction indicated are asset controlling suppliers, largely Bonneville Power Administration, that spans multiple Northwest states. Dual carbon costs can be addressed through future possible linkage. Once linked, electricity generation in the linked jurisdiction would be covered in the same way as in-state generation. This ensures that leakage does not occur between jurisdictions. Electricity generated in the linked jurisdiction and then imported to California would not face an additional carbon cost. One challenge with this approach is that the linkage process can be complex and lengthy. For California, linkage must follow and meet the requirements of SB 1018. This includes equivalent or stricter program and enforcement, alignment of certain program design elements, ensuring linkage does not impede enforcement of California's laws or impose liability on California, an agreement between jurisdictions, findings by the governor, and approval by the board through a formal rulemaking process. Other jurisdictions may also have separate linkage processes and requirements. Quebec, California's linkage partner since 2014, currently implements an approach that applies the full Quebec compliance obligation on electricity imports after counteracting the carbon price from the other jurisdiction by providing freely allocated allowances. Quebec provides free allowances to electricity importers equal in value to the average carbon cost during the reporting year in the other jurisdiction, and then assesses the full compliance obligation on the imported electricity. Under the Quebec approach, electricity imports to Quebec from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, jurisdictions are provided allocation per the equation below, where compliance obligation is the compliance obligation that the generator occurs in the RGGI system for the electricity imported to Quebec. Average RGGI price is the weighted average sale price of allowances sold at RGGI auctions in the data year, and average WCI price is the weighted average sale price of allowances sold at WC auctions in the data year. The last option staff is evaluating is to rely on the other jurisdiction to address dual cost via exemption or freely allocated allowances for electricity exported to California. This approach is simple for California but requires action by other jurisdictions. It also enables other jurisdictions to address dual costs without needing to wait for a California regulatory change. Staff is requesting feedback on the following. Should CARB develop a mechanism to address dual carbon costs for electricity imports? What are the pros and cons of the options under consideration? Are there other options that should be considered? Under such a mechanism, what types of carbon pricing programs should be recognized? Should the evaluation of carbon costs account for alternative compliance mechanisms? And should the amount of free allocation and whether that allocation can be used for compliance be a consideration? We'll now conclude the presentation on electricity topics with a discussion of the RPS adjustment. The Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS adjustment, provides electricity importers an optional avenue to reduce their compliance obligation for RPS eligible generation from out-of-state sources, provided that the electricity is not directly delivered to California. The RPS adjustment does not provide recognition for avoided emissions. Rather, CARB implemented the RPS adjustment at the start of the cap and trade program to recognize the cost of compliance with the RPS program for importers, generally portfolio content category 2 renewable energy credits, or RECs. All emissions from imported electricity are reflected in CARB's emissions inventory and are not impacted by the RPS adjustment. In order to be eligible for the RPS adjustment, electricity must meet the criteria that is outlined in Section 95852B4, which specifies electricity importers must have either 1, ownership or contract rights to procure the electricity and associated RECs generated by the eligible renewable energy resource, or 2, a contract with an entity subject to the California RPS that has ownership or contract rights to the electricity and associated RECs generated by the eligible renewable energy resource as verified pursuant to MRR. RECs associated with the electricity with an RPS adjustment claim must be placed in a retirement subaccount belonging to the entities subject to compliance with the RPS. These RECs must be designated as retired for the purpose of compliance with the RPS program. RPS adjustment eligible electricity must also not be directly delivered to California or imported from a linked jurisdiction. While CARB staff previously considered removing the RPS adjustment in 2015, the provision was ultimately preserved in response to stakeholder feedback. Since then, state policy and the regulatory landscape has changed. Over time, the role of Portfolio Content Category 2, or PCC2 renewable energy credits in the RPS has decreased, becoming a smaller part of RPS requirements. In addition to the declining role of generation eligible for the RPS adjustment, the electricity sector now has integrated resource planning targets that were recently updated to support the deep decarbonization necessary to achieve our AB 32 and AB 1279 targets and SB 100's target for a zero carbon electricity resource supply. Given these changes, CARB is evaluating whether the RPS adjustment should be maintained. Despite the changes in PCC2 requirements as the RPS percentage has increased, so have RPS adjustment claims. On this slide, you can see that RPS adjustment claims have continually increased as a share of electricity imports. More than 20 entities claim the RPS adjustment, with claims totaling in millions of metric tons annually. As a percentage of imported electricity emissions, the use of the RPS adjustment is growing as the electricity grid gets cleaner. Implementation of the RPS adjustment faces several ongoing challenges. It can be difficult to verify that electricity has not been directly delivered to California, particularly when not all generation is tagged. It is also difficult to accurately report and verify claims in situations where portions of RPS eligible generation are directly delivered and portions are not directly delivered and are claimed as RPS adjustment. Reporting and verification are further complicated due to multiple reporting entities claiming portions of the electricity from the same generator. Confidentiality agreements also limit CARB staff's ability to communicate with counterparties, stymieing verification efforts. Finally, because reporting requirements for the RPS adjustment differ from electricity import requirements, it creates difficulty in reporting and verification. CARB staff is evaluating the potential phase out of the RPS adjustment in 2030 to align with the deep decarbonization necessary to achieve SB 100 zero carbon electricity goals and the 30 to 38 million metric ton CO2e integrated resource planning target for 2030 set by CARB as part of the 2022 scoping plan update. A planned phase out would provide entities with certainty and time for entities to respond. Staff is requesting feedback on the following. How should CARB align the RPS adjustment with state climate policy? Should the RPS adjustment be phased out? And if so, what timeline should be considered for a phase out? And what, if any, interim changes should CARB make to the RPS adjustment? We'll now move into feedback on electricity topics. And as a reminder, if you'd like to share feedback or ask questions, please use the raise hand function, which should be located on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window as shown. When staff calls your name and activates your audio controls, please click the unmute button and proceed to introduce yourself, give your affiliation, and provide your comment. We're limiting comments today to 3 minutes to accommodate as many people as we can. Please reference the timer that will be on the top right of the slide very shortly. Stakeholders will also be able to submit written feedback online until October 26th at 11:59 p.m. Pacific time. You can find a link to submit feedback as well as all relevant documents on our Cap and Trade meetings and workshops page. With that, I'll now pass things to my colleague, Michael Turgan, who will be facilitating the public comment session.
Thank you, Camille. Yes, I will be running the show here for the public comments on electricity sector topics. Looks like right now we only have one hand raised. So everyone else feel free to get in the queue if you have comments to add, but we will start with Claire Breidenich. Claire, it looks like you should have the ability to unmute now, so go ahead and do so and provide your comment.
Great, thank you, I appreciate it. This is quite a meaty subject, and I've got a number of comments, not on everything. First, on the issue of the electricity markets and emissions leakage, WPTF does feel that CARB needs to consider different approaches to addressing emissions leakage in the market. We have a couple of concerns here. One is that I think the CAISO is on weak legal ground if there are not provisions in the regulation that enable the CAISO to give effect in their market to reducing emissions leakage. So I think you've acknowledged that what the CAISO is currently doing in terms of its minimizing secondary dispatch is an implicit surplus calculation. However, you have no provisions for regulating surplus in your regulation. So I think you need anything that is done in the CAISO market, I think requires a restriction or an equivalent provision in the regulation that gives them authority to restrict it. Second, I think we have concerns with the way that CAISO is doing its emissions leakage approach, particularly around surplus. And we think there are definitions that would be more flexible and better help CARB achieve its emission reductions goals. The other thing I think that needs to be considered is the possibility of allowing unspecified imports via the organized market. And the reason we're interested in this is we believe if CAISO is effective in eliminating secondary dispatch, there may be periods where the market simply runs out of resources that are eligible to be specified or are ineconomic to be specified, with the result that they might have to call on a higher cost, higher emission resource. The other thing I want to say that you haven't mentioned is I think it's high time to update the emission factor, the default emission factor for unspecified imports, since it's 10 years old. Glad you're addressing energy storage. On the question of the reciprocity of energy that's had an import from another pricing jurisdiction but is not linked, I think the approach that we would probably think is more applicable or most appropriate is something that looks similar to the Quebec approach. I'm not sure it makes sense to issue allowances. It could instead be based on accrediting of an emissions for costs paid in the other program. But the other thing I would note, given that Washington's prices are so much higher than California's right now, if prices are higher in the other jurisdiction, I think it makes sense to completely negate the carbon obligation for imports into California. Thank you.
Thank you for your
Claire,
comments. Yep, go for it, Rachel.
thanks, Michael. Claire, thanks for those comments. Really appreciate them. I think it would be really helpful for us to get written comment feedback from you related to what you laid out on the EDAM and WEIM. There were portions there where I wasn't sure if you were referring to CARB's regulations or CAISO's changes that are going before FERC. So having that, oh, my camera's off. There we go. Maybe that will help. Sorry about that. It will help if you could lay that in your written comments, and very much appreciate the comments on the other topics as well. So we're looking forward to your follow-up.
Great. So we only have one other hand up at this time, and that is Cindy Parsons. Cindy, you should be able to unmute now, so please do so and provide your comment.
Thanks. This is Cindy Parsons with Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and I have a number of points. The first two are clarifying questions. So on slide 19, you state that any changes to GHG accounting for electricity imports must meet state and federal statutory requirements. Could you please identify the specific state and federal statutory requirements? Point 2 on slide 22. If electricity transaction in EDAM will be settled in WEIM, it seems the outstanding emissions should be EIM only. If an entity participates in both EDAM and EIM, how would the outstanding emissions for that entity be calculated? Regarding the outstanding emissions, point 1, outstanding emissions is an estimate of leakage based on the default GHG factor. The value of allowances retired to satisfy the compliance obligation for outstanding emissions over the past 5 years was approximately $103.5 million. That is real money that could have been invested to reduce GHG emissions. We request that CARB consider the cost benefits to California of LADWP's load-based accounting design for the EDAM, EIM, GHG reporting and compliance, which could eliminate leakage and the outstanding emissions compliance obligation. If EDAM transactions are added to outstanding emissions, how much will the compliance obligation increase? Will the EDU allowance allocation be sufficient to cover that compliance obligation, as well as the EDU's own compliance obligation? For jurisdictions and entities with a goal to achieve carbon neutrality or a zero carbon electricity supply, outstanding emissions will impact their GHG emissions inventories. The outstanding emissions should not be a barrier to participation in the electricity markets. Recognizing that any changes on CARB's end with regards to market GHG emission accounting are contingent on CAISO regs and procedures, we have some questions for CARB. So if CAISO adopts a new approach to market GHG accounting, is CARB willing to adapt their regulations and the FJD interpretation to accommodate the new design? If CAISO can calculate GHG emissions for the imported electricity more accurately, is CARB open to a more accurate GHG intensity factor instead of the default GHG factor? And one more point regarding RPS adjustment. LADWP needs the RPS adjustment to continue until our contracts expire. Thanks for the opportunity to comment.
Thanks, Cindy, for all of those questions and thoughts. It would be really helpful for us if we could see those in writing. I'll try to address a couple of them now. One thing I just wanted to clarify about the sort of the initial thinking that Tess laid out earlier is that is currently focused on what CAISO has filed at FERC and the current proposal that is on the table. And so that is what we are focusing our potential reg changes on. And I want to highlight that our thinking around the outstanding emissions calculation is to reflect really the improvements made in the approach that CAISO is taking and ensure that our emissions leakage, our coverage of emissions leakage and the integrity of the program is maintained and is also, right sized to reflect that. So you'll see in those slides that Tess presented earlier that the calculation of the outstanding emissions is limited to reflect those changes. And we expect that will really help support the kind of coverage of emissions leakage that we need for the integrity of the program, but also be able to be right-sized for the problem. And with that, I'll leave it there for now. I know we have some other commenters. Thank you.
Great. Yes, we will move on to our next commenter, who is Austin Avery. Austin, you should be able to unmute now, so please do so and provide your comment.
Thank you so much. This is Austin Avery from Turlock Irrigation District. So TID wants to raise a few concerns regarding CARB's potential phase out of the RPS adjustment. First thing is the historical intent of RPS. The RPS adjustment was to recognize the early investment action taken by utilities such as TID to procure out-of-state intermittent renewables, such as our investment into the Tuolumne Wind Project, which is a 136 megawatt wind farm located in the state of Washington, and having the ability to count those resources being carbon-free as well as renewable, because these investments were made before the development of CARB's MRR and the cap and trade program, as well as POUs being subject to RPS. RPS was based on having the power firmed and shaped, so utilities at the time could take the power and it didn't cause reliability issues and was more economically efficient. Should CARB decide to phase out the RPS adjustment as described on slide 47, entities such as TID would be unjustly penalized for taking early action to procure renewable energy on behalf of our customers. The explanation given to early actors in the past, such as TID to date from CARB, with respect to the potential elimination of the RPS adjustment, has been tied to the administrative difficulty towards verifying and reporting for electricity that has been firmed and shaped. When we're talking about this, the other point that I want to make too is that while PCC2 renewables have decreased on the percentage basis that we can use for compliance, PCC0 hasn't. And this ties back to the negative implications that entities like TID has as an early actor. So TID would implore CARB to work with all of the good faith utilities that have invested in renewables prior to MRR, cap and trade, and the RPS being subject to POUs, such as the investment that we made into TWP, and to work with us on capturing the reporting and verification that you'll need for these out-of-state intermittent renewables, while also not unjustly penalizing utilities such as TID, who made early investments prior to any regulatory directives to clean the grid and to serve our customers. So thank you for that.
Austin, thank you for those comments. Appreciate you engaging on this topic, and really looking forward to getting some additional details from you about what changes you think could be made to the RPS to address some of the considerations and concerns that we highlighted in today's meeting. Thanks.
Great. So at this time, it looks like we only have one additional hand up. So if you would still like to provide a comment on this section, please use the raise hand function to join the queue. But at this time, we will now hear a comment from Nicholas Berkey. Nicholas, you should now be able to unmute yourself, so please do so and provide your comment.
Thank you. Nick Berkey from Anaheim Public Utilities again. I just wanted to speak on a couple different topics. The first one being the FJD issue that Cindy so nicely mentioned. I know LA has a proposal that would change the first jurisdictional deliver from the deliverer to the recipient. In discussions with the ISO, they say that the ISO can identify where that EIM energy is being delivered down to the node. And in my opinion, that's a much more accurate method than proportionally distributing it to all EDUs through the state. And I implore CARB to work with the ISO on determining if this is a viable solution. Right now, it seems like the ISO is waiting for CARB and CARB is waiting for the ISO. And as I told the ISO previously, and I'll tell CARB the same thing, I would love it if you guys can reach out and work together on this one. As for the default emissions factor, I agree with, I believe it is WTPF, that it has been a long time, and I do not know if the 0.428 is a valid number or a stale number, but I would appreciate if CARB could make that an issue to address in this rulemaking. If no update is needed, then I ask that CARB make the supporting data public, so that way stakeholders can review it as well. And finally, regarding the RPS adjustment, RPS is the driving force of the electric sector's GHG reductions. So I believe the cap and trade regs should follow, not lead, the RPS regs when it comes to recognizing a valid RPS bucket type. I know this has a historical significance, and a lot of entities are waiting for their previous contracts to end. But it being that it's still a part of the RPS program, I think it would be best if the cap and trade and RPS regs aligned. I know that the verification requirements for a bucket 2 an RPS adjustment are quite stringent now, much more than they used to be prior to the previous rulemaking. But I think it's something that should not be phased out because it is a valid RPS bucket. Thank you very much again, and look forward to working with you, and we'll submit comments along the lines of my comments.
Thank you, Nick. I want to just speak on a couple of the items that you mentioned. And first, I want to talk about the suggestion to change the point of regulation for electricity imports. CARB is not considering changing the point of regulation for electricity imports. That has been a fundamental part of the program since we started, and it has a lot of legal considerations and important design features that are not going to be reopened at this time. So I wanted to clarify that. We welcome your comments and feedback on other ways that we can think about addressing emissions leakage through outstanding emissions or another approach, given that framework. And then thank you very much for the question about the default emissions factor. We will take that up internally and get back to you.
We will get started on our last topic for today. And this last session will focus on treatment of biogenic emissions within the cap and trade program. And there'll be a public comments opportunity at the end of this as well. We want to emphasize that all initial concepts discussed today are developed by CARB staff with the intent to provide consistent treatment of biogenic fuels and emissions within the program, informed by AB 32 mandates, best available science and data, scoping plan goals, implementation experience, and the growing state of the biofuel sector. The discussion will focus on three main topics: process CO2 emissions, biomethane provisions, and exempt biogenic fuels and feedstocks. Within the cap and trade program, combustion CO2 emissions from certain biofuels may be exempt if they meet program eligibility and reporting requirements. Notably, biogenic CO2 exemption provisions do not consistently address processed CO2 emissions across feedstocks, such as processed CO2 emitted during hydrogen production from biomethane. The existing provisions were largely developed during the initial 2010 rulemaking when biofuel use was limited to combustion. With the potential to use biogenic fuels and feedstocks in a growing variety of applications, CARB staff are considering amending biogenic CO2 exemption provisions to provide equal treatment to process and combustion CO2 emissions. One area where CARB staff anticipates growth is the reporting of biomethane use by covered entities within the program. This is informed by stakeholder conversations and the scoping plan scenario, which models biomethane use growing rapidly in sectors outside of transportation to achieve decarbonization. Cap and trade covered entities may apply book and claim style accounting to reported biomethane fuel that is not directly delivered to the end user. Existing cap and trade exemption eligibility requirements for imported biomethane guard against resource shuffling and potential emissions leakage. Cap and trade and MRR currently accommodate covered entities claiming biomethane matched to biomethane injected into a common carrier pipeline within the same calendar year. For comparison, biomethane credited in the LCFS program for use in California's transportation sector may be reported using book and claim accounting if the biomethane is injected into a North American common carrier pipeline and is claimed within 3/4 of injection. Staff is requesting feedback on the following topics related to biomethane treatment in the cap and trade program. How can cap and trade support biomethane end uses in non-transportation sectors? Should cap and trade clarify or incorporate additional deliverability and time matching requirements for biomethane injected into a common carrier pipeline to support verifiability and integrity of emissions reductions? Should cap and trade modify existing resource shuffling requirements for imported biomethane to better enable reporting of eligible out-of-state biomethane while still protecting against emissions leakage? And should any new or modified requirements be aligned with existing California programs? The final biogenic emissions topic today is focused on a broader discussion of the biofuels eligible for exemption from a compliance obligation. This slide presents the high-level framework for treatment of biogenic emissions within cap and trade. The default within the cap and trade program is that all reported biomass-derived fuels incur a compliance obligation for every metric ton of CO2e emissions inclusive of biogenic CO2 emissions. This compliance obligation can only be reduced if specific exemption requirements are met. One of these exemption requirements is that only biomass-derived fuels specifically listed in 95852.2a are eligible to have CO2 emissions exempt from a compliance obligation. Listed fuels include a variety of biogenic waste and residues, wood from timber management plants for fire reduction or forest improvement, biomethane and biogas generated from biogenic waste, and all renewable diesel, ethanol, and biodiesel. CO2 from reported biomass-derived fuels not listed in 95852.2a incurs a compliance obligation. This framework was determined in the initial 2010 rulemaking when biofuel use in California was largely static and limited to long-standing uses. CARB has received feedback from stakeholders noting an uncertain regulatory environment for emerging biofuels and biofuel applications. Stakeholders have expressed uncertainty about treatment of biofuels that are derived from exempt listed biofuels, for example, biochar from wood harvested for forest stand improvement, or produced simultaneously alongside of exempt listed biofuels, for example, biogenic naphtha that is a byproduct of renewable diesel production. Stakeholders have commented the program could be better positioned to provide consistent treatment to biofuels as the sector experiences growth and innovation, with incentives and demand for decarbonization options increasing. In CARB's consideration of the treatment of biomass and biomass-derived fuels, we must ensure the program follows the mandates of AB 32, the authorizing legislation for the Cap and Trade program. Importantly, per AB 32, as we have mentioned many times, any CARB regulations adopted to achieve greenhouse gas reductions shall ensure reductions achieved shall minimize emissions leakage. Again, emissions leakage is a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions in state that has a corresponding increase in out-of-state greenhouse gas emissions. The Cap and Trade regulation reflects the AB 32 mandate in a wide variety of provisions designed to avoid, minimize, or mitigate for many forms of emissions leakage, including industrial allowance allocation to minimize leakage associated with a shift to out-of-state production, electricity resource shuffling provisions, coverage of imported electricity, and as Tess described earlier, provisions addressing leakage in the WEIM. Resource shuffling provisions for imported biomethane, addressing leakage associated with importing biomethane that had existing use as an out-of-state fuel, resulting in potentially increased use of natural gas out of state. Emissions leakage provisions have been added or updated throughout the history of the program, informed by sector behavior, program data, implementation experience, and scientific literature. Under this context and the quickly evolving nature of the biofuel sector, CARB staff are considering biofuel use under the framework of emissions leakage. Currently in the program, biogenic CO2 emissions from common transportation biofuels, which are renewable diesel, biodiesel, and ethanol, are exempt in the program regardless of biomass feedstock. However, the use of agricultural land to grow crops for biofuel production can result in release of stored biogenic CO2 due to land use change, which is a systemic phenomenon where land is converted to agriculture as a result of financial incentives due to increased feedstock demand. Deforestation and land conversion for agricultural use is expected to occur primarily outside of California. The 2022 scoping plan acknowledged the developments in the biofuel space by specifically directing California to use the best available science to ensure that raw materials used to produce transportation fuels do not incentivize consumption of feedstocks with little to no GHG reductions from a life cycle perspective. Ensure production of internal alternative fuels does not come at the expense of global deforestation, unsustainable land conversion, or adverse food supply impacts, and ensure that California policies send appropriate market signals and do not result in unintended consequences. Under the context of stakeholder feedback on regulatory uncertainty, the evolving nature of biofuel use and production, and AB 30 mandates and scoping plan direction, CARB staff requests the following feedback to inform initial concepts for potential updates to biofuel treatment within the program. First, how could CARB ensure a clear pathway for reporting biomass-derived fuel use under MRR and for treatment of biogenic CO2 emissions in Cap and Trade? Should emissions exemptions be amended to provide consistent treatment of biomass and biomass-derived fuels based on their source biomass? Within Cap and Trade, how should biomass and biomass-derived fuels be evaluated and accounted for in a manner consistent with AB 32 mandates and scoping plan directives? And Would any supplier or supply of biogenic transportation fuels, gaseous or liquid biomethane, or biogenic propane not be addressed by emission categories for suppliers of natural gas, CNG, LNG, RBOB, distillate fuels, LPG, or blended fuels as specified in 95852? CARB also requests the following feedback on the general reporting of biofuels to MRR. What biomass-derived fuels or non-fossil fuels with associated greenhouse gas emissions not listed in 95852.2a of Cap and Trade are currently or likely to be used in California in the next decade? Do any of these fuels pose specific challenges with regard to accurate quantification and or reporting of emissions? For example, challenges measuring the biomass fraction. And are there emission factors that can be incorporated by MRR to calculate greenhouse gas emissions for fuels not currently listed under 95852.2a of Cap and Trade? CARB also requests the following more specific feedback on the reporting of transportation biofuels to MRR. How could terminal position holders know the biomass source of supplied biofuels? How could terminal position holders know the biogenic content of supplied fuels? For example, the biogenic content of finished fuels containing renewable diesel or renewable naphtha. What challenges might terminal position holders face with determining or documenting biogenic content and biomass source? How will existing and emerging transportation biofuels be distributed in California? And if blended with other fuels, what fuels will biofuels be blended with? Under what product names will the fuels be marketed? And where will blending occur? We will now move into feedback on biogenic and limited emissions exemptions. On biogenic exemptions. As a reminder, if you would like to share feedback or ask questions, please use the raise hand function, which is located on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window as shown. When staff calls your name and activates your audio controls, please click the unmute button, proceed to introduce yourself, give your affiliation, and provide your comment. We are limiting comments today to 3 minutes to accommodate as many people as we can. Please reference the timer on the top right of the slide, which will be there shortly. And our plan is to close public comment by 4 p.m. Stakeholders will also be able to submit written feedback online until October 26th at 11:59 p.m. Pacific time. You can find a link to submit feedback as well as all of the relevant documents on our Cap and Trade meetings and workshops page. And now, what time is it? I will pass things to my colleague, Michael Turgan, who will be facilitating the public comment session.
Thanks, Camille. Okay, we will kick off this final round of public comments. Right now, it looks like we only have one hand raised in the queue. Now we're up to 2, but we will start with Sam Wade. Sam, you should be able to unmute yourself now, so please do so and provide your comment. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Michael. This is Sam Wade with the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas. We're the National Trade Association for the RNG industry. Thanks for paying attention to biofuels generally and renewable natural gas specifically. We feel that an important step would be to look first at alignment with existing reporting requirements under the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which has been a primary driver of biofuel adoption in California. And it already includes explicit requirements to address issues such as indirect land use change. And then specifically to renewable natural gas, we recommend the use of a digital tracking system, sometimes called a registry, and specifically the MRET system for renewable thermal attributes. This type of digital infrastructure that's designed to sort of support thousands of RNG projects being accounted for smoothly is much better than the sort of paper records that CARB staff currently uses under the Cap and Trade system. And it's been proven to work in Europe and in other parts of the world with high penetration of renewable natural gas in the pipeline. We also note that it would allow California to align accounting with Quebec and potentially other linked partners because the MRET system does have full coverage of North America. And it would also basically allow a method to ensure no double counting with other states' programs. The one source of truth concept is very essential as we get more and more RNG projects deployed nationwide. And the last thing developers want is to be accused of double claims. And so if we could develop one registry across North America to account for the ownership of the benefits of renewable natural gas, it would be the optimal outcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Appreciate those comments and looking forward to see them in writing so that we can assess them in more detail. Thanks so much for the comments.
Great. Okay, looks like at this time we only have one additional hand raised. Oh, back up to two. So the next commenter we will hear from is Ruben Lubowski. Ruben, you should be able to unmute now, so please do so and provide your comment.
Great, thanks very much. Hi, everybody. This is Ruben Lubowski. I am Chief of Carbon Strategy at Lombard ODA Investment Managers, also adjunct professor at Columbia University and formerly of Environmental Defense Fund for many years. I'm speaking today in my personal capacity as somebody interested in the success of California climate policy and good policy design. My comments are, first of all, to applaud CARB for digging into this issue of the accounting of biogenic emissions. I think it's been long overdue and really an important part of improving the program. My second comment is in line with the previous speaker to highlight that I think aligning as much as possible with the LCFS is the way to go and the most logical approach. There shouldn't be any double counting of emissions within the cap and trade program. So there might be some need to adjust any emissions that are otherwise accounted for under the cap and trade program relative to the LCFS. But it doesn't make sense that sort of a first principles that one program would consider emissions to be one number and then another program to have the emissions be something else. I mean, it really makes sense to align this as much as possible. And that leads me to my third point, that I'm concerned about a potential unintended interaction and leakage between the LCFS and cap and trade, particularly for the exempt fuels. So if there are fuels that have exempt emissions under cap and trade, but have emissions intensity scores above 0 under the LCFS, you could have a situation where the LCFS, particularly under the new rulemaking, is driving ambitious progress and more of these fuels coming into the market, but then any reductions achieved under that program could be negated if those fuels are now no longer covered under the cap and trade program, such that those allowances are now basically being freed up and allowing emissions to go up. This could completely negate the benefits under the LCFS. So it's very important, I think, for CARB to align as much as possible these programs, think about these interactions, either by aligning the emissions accounting as much as possible, or explicitly having some way to then cancel any emissions that are being dropped out of the emissions budgets. But I think this potential interaction is important. As said earlier by one of the speakers, it's very important to think about these programs, how they're working together and not in isolation. So again, it's a really important topic, and appreciate hearing more about how you may have thought about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben. Well, I'll cede to Matt.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, Ruben, just a couple of quick points I want to make here, and that is that when it comes to tracking progress towards our overall climate objectives, whether it's the SB 32 2030 target or our carbon neutrality objectives, I want to be clear about one thing, and that is that there's no double counting going on in our emissions accounting towards our climate objectives. We have our greenhouse gas inventory, and we also have our cap and trade program that rely on looking at AB 32 related emissions within the state, as well as imported electricity. We've got a very clear standard for accounting that we apply to our emissions inventory that is aligned with cap and trade. Now, when it comes to the question about coordination across the programs, yes, you know, there is some very clear relationships between LCFS and cap and trade when it comes to the transportation fuel market. And what we use the low carbon fuel standard to do here in California is to bring the lowest carbon intensive fuels into the transportation fuel pool and to support the broad deployment of zero emission transportation as well as low CI fuels in that sector. And that gets picked up in the overall emissions inventory as we look at the types of fuels that are used here in California and the emissions associated with those are petroleum fuels, or those are fuels with biogenic emissions that are part of the biogenic carbon cycle. And so there's a complementary effect of how we treat those fuels under the cap and trade program and how they're incentivized to be brought to California by the LCFS that we're very aware of, and you know, ultimately is helping to really drive deeper decarbonization in the transportation fuel pool, and you know, is being reflected in our progress in our inventory, but not double counted. And I think that's an important distinction that I want to make.
Great, thank you, Matt, for that addition. It looks like at this time we have 2 commenters in the queue. So next up will be Stephen Rosenblum. Stephen, you should be able to unmute yourself now, so please do so and provide your comments.
Hi, thanks for this presentation. I really appreciate CARB's effort to take on the issue of biogenic fuels and how to deal with them properly. And I'd like to just talk about things at high altitude, since verbal comments really aren't well suited to delving into details. I think the first point I'd like to make is that all carbon dioxide emissions cause global warming, regardless of where the source is. If it's been buried underground for a million years or 2 years, the carbon dioxide still causes the same amount of global warming, and it's still in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, causing warming for over that length of time. So I think you know, the whole concept of renewable fuels being carbon-based is wrong. We need to stop consumption of carbon and emitting of global warming gases such as methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as soon as possible, regardless of the source. And then I'd like to sort of belabor the point that Mr. Lubowski made about unintended consequences of the LCFS and coordination with the LCFS. The LCFS had avoided emission credits for methane from manure, and this has caused a manure gold rush all over the country. So what it's encouraged is the production of manure by dairy farms and cattle farms and swine farms, rather than doing what people do in Europe, which is to collect the manure in dry way of management methods. It's converted to a slurry and purposely fermented into methane. Now, this not only creates more methane, but it also creates methane leakage. And if any of that methane leaks, it essentially negates all the effort of converting it to some fuel. So I think to make sure that we don't repeat what I consider a mistake in the LCFS, whatever CARB decides to do about biogenic sources of fuel, they should not repeat this mistake to encourage digesters. The second thing of unintended consequences is the question which was left out of the discussion of encouragement of biofuels from agricultural products and the competition with food. It's going to inevitably increase food prices since the feedstocks for these biodiesel type fuels are soybeans, peanut oil. And once all the waste oils are used up, that's what's going to be used. And there's going to be increases in food prices inevitably. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate the comments. I want to make a couple of clarifying points just real quickly. And you know, while we are here to talk about the cap and trade program more specifically, as you know, you and other commenters have mentioned, there's a broader climate policy at play here, and there's interactions between programs like the low carbon fuel standard and the cap and trade program that are important to consider. And on the point about dairy methane, I think that is an important area to consider, and I'll clarify that dairy manure methane, enteric methane, dairy methane, livestock methane, it's not covered under the cap and trade program. Those are not emissions that are reflected in the caps. Those are methane emissions that are and historically have been getting released into the atmosphere in California and in other states. And those are very strong climate forcing pollutants that we've worked really hard to reduce here in California. We have legislation that actually directs us to reduce methane emissions from dairies and from others. And how we treat that dairy methane emissions, how we reduce those dairy methane emissions through things like the deployment of anaerobic digesters and the capture of that methane and the use of that biomethane as a energy source is a strategy that the state has deployed to help reduce methane emissions more broadly. And as I mentioned earlier, because it's not under the cap and trade program, those emissions aren't covered by the program. There's a separate strategy to reduce those emissions through the deployment of digesters and the use of LCFS credits and incentives to help capture that methane and use it in the transportation space currently, but also there's an opportunity to move that into other sectors. And so as we think about the cap and trade program and the sectors that it does cover, we're asking ourselves these questions about how can we use these complementary programs like the LCFS, like the biomethane capture that we're doing to reduce methane emissions that need to be reduced, to use that energy source for other sectors. And the treatment of biogenic emissions in the cap and trade sector does provide some incentive to use non-fossil based fuels in the sector because they are treated as a zero compliance obligation under the cap and trade program. And so the effect of those two complementary policies is one of reducing fossil fuel and energy intensive or greenhouse gas intensive fuels in the industrial and electricity and commercial sectors under the cap and trade program, and finding alternatives that are supported through other policies, complementary policies like the LCFS. I think maybe I'll leave it there for the time being, but happy to have additional conversations on this with questions if folks have them.
Great, thank you, Matt, and thank you everybody for your comments. At this time, we don't have any additional hands in the queue, so we'll take a moment in case anyone has any last thoughts to contribute. But otherwise, I will turn it back over to Mark, who will provide some closing comments. So thank you all again.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to everybody really for staying with us this morning and this afternoon to hear about some initial thoughts about updates to the cap and trade program. Recognize we covered some pretty meaty topics today, some of which can be challenging to just cover in verbal public comments. Invite everybody who's tuned in to visit our meeting and workshop page and submit written feedback, which can be useful for fleshing out some details and giving us something a little more firm to respond to. So, again, just want to thank you for your participation today and for the feedback that we received from everybody. And with that, I believe we can wrap up a little early this afternoon. We will be do anticipate having some additional workshops in the coming months with additional information about the cap and trade program. So stay tuned for those, and thank you for your participation today.